Imagine this. You've just had the worst day of your life. The mammoth you were hunting trampled your cousin. The fire went out again. And now, your tribe says, you've broken the sacred rules. You're dragged into a Stone Age prison. There are no metal bars, no wardens with walkie-talkies, just sharp rocks, pointy sticks, and a bunch of people who believe that rehabilitation means skinning you alive. Welcome to bedtime. Yes, you heard me. Tonight's story isn't about cozy pajamas or lavender-scented dreams. It's about the forgotten justice systems of our prehistoric ancestors, when crime and punishment were terrifyingly creative. But don't worry, you're safe under your blanket. You won't be skinned alive. Unless your cat decides it's time to knead your stomach with claws out. We're traveling back 900,000 years, a time when humans were few, mammoths were many, and prisons were basically caves that smelled like wet fur. We'll explore what these punishment rituals meant, how they kept tiny tribes together, and, because this is a sleep story, we'll also laugh at how ridiculous some of it sounds. After all, nothing says justice like being tied to a log while someone lectures you about stealing berries. So, get comfortable, pull the covers up, let the darkness outside fade away, and prepare to drift into sleep while learning about the Stone Age's weirdest, darkest, and occasionally funniest attempts at law and order. Because nothing whispers sweet dreams like the phrase prehistoric skinning chamber. The first thing to know is that the night didn't care about your schedule. It draped itself over the plains like a fur you didn't ask to borrow, cold as stone and just as patient. Breath rose in little ghosts from every mouth, human and animal, and even the trees seemed to huddle closer, branches whispering to each other in a language older than thunder. Somewhere, beyond the black ribs of acacia and the pale sweep of grass, caught under moonlight, a hyena laughed the way only a hyena can, cheerfully rude, like a neighbor who always forgets they live next to people with nerves. The world, 900,000 years ago, was not an empty stage, but a crowded theater. It only looked vast, because every seat was taken by something that wanted to keep living. You could feel it in the air, that thrumming argument of survival, constant as your heartbeat, and twice as loud when you were hungry. Rocks kept secrets. Rivers chewed on the bones of yesterday and hummed about it. Even the wind had opinions, most of which were, wrap that fur tighter, and do not light your fire under a dead tree unless you like surprises. Now look closer there, in the couch of tall grass, pressed by a day's worth of small feet. A cluster of sleeping figures, not quite still, not quite safe. Each one, a miracle that didn't yet know the word. They are our cousins, or rather, we are theirs. Quick-eyed primates, with hands that tell long stories. Their tools are simple because the syllabus is demanding, and the professor is the sky. A hand axe knocks sparks from the dark when struck with the right stone. A flake draws meat from sinew, the way a violin bow coaxes a note from quiet. Fire is not a pet, but a capricious god briefly persuaded to sit in the circle and keep its teeth to itself. These people whisper to each other, the way water whispers to rock, slow and shaping. They hum to the sleeping children, and their voices are soft in the way of people who have learned that loudness tempts attention, and attention brings eyes, and eyes belong to things with better teeth. Daylight reveals a palette so clean it feels brand new. Blue gets poured from horizon to horizon. The grass sparkles with a million cold mouths. Far off, a line of elephants moves like a slow thought carrying its own weather. Above them, the sun does its best impression of certainty. The band breaks the night camp with practiced economy. Embers dusted, ashes scattered, tracks brushed. Everyone carries something, even the toddlers. A community is a relay, and the baton is alive. The morning's decisions are small, but decisive. Where is the wind? Where did the baboons shout last night? Which slope faces the sun early enough to chase off the bone-deep chill? Scientists, much later, will name this microhabitat selection. The band calls it Where We Won't Die Today. Listen, and you'll hear how dense the silence island. It's full of maps. A bird that usually scolds has stopped scolding. Why? A clatter of hooves that doesn't match the gait of antelope. Whose hooves are those? There is a grammar to these signs, and the elders are fluent. They point with chins, with eyes, with the light tap of a finger on a forearm that says, not now, but soon. A child watches and learns what any good university leaves for last, the skill of noticing. A good eye is worth a sharp spear, and without the eye, the spear is just a loud way to announce to the hyenas that you're tired. You might think of this landscape as wilderness, but from inside the band it feels like a kitchen, a workshop, a library with no walls. The term Stone Age makes it sound like nothing moved except rocks. In truth, everything moved, including the rules. Seasons braided and unbraided over the land. Rivers wandered as if distracted by clouds, and the animals voted with their feet. The people kept up by reinventing ordinary every day. A hand axe became a scraper, became a cutter, became a gift. Some nights, when the winds fell asleep and the stars had nothing better to do than glitter, they told each other stories about why the moon is careful and why the leopard is not. Laughter came easily because the alternative was trembling. Humor was not decoration. It was insulation, a woolen lining inside the coat of fear. When an elder joked that the wind stole his hair, nothing to do with age, he insisted it reassured the children that even the things you can't see can be teased into friendship. Water mattered the way breathing matters. The band learned the character of each stream, the way you learn the character of each cousin. This one generous, but easily offended by feet. That one stingy in the dry months, but surprisingly forgiving after storms. They tasted mud, the way a sommelier tastes a Pinot, noting that this patch suggests the presence of roots worth digging, and that one whispers of buried water they could coax upward with patient hands. The folders in their mental filing cabinets were labeled with smells, and the angle of light, with the taste of dust, and the same hawk flying the same circle at the same time each day. What looked like aimless wandering was choreography. What sounded like chit-chat was committee. Predators kept the curriculum rigorous. Lions did not sign up for office hours. Crocodiles submitted their feedback anonymously. Even the innocent-looking hippo was a kind of pop quiz you could fail only once. People kept their senses worn smooth from use. Babies learned quickly to cry like whispers, and mothers thanked them with little tickles that said, "Well done, small partner." Men and women both watched the horizon as if it were a rumor about to arrive. Being alive was teamwork, and everyone knew the assignment. Keep everyone else alive. That's what love looked like before poetry. It looked like vigilance, distributed across a perimeter. Sometimes, when the day was generous and bellies were full, games cracked the solemn mask. Children chased each other with ostrich feathers. Elders pretended to be terrible monsters with 3 heads and 6 knees, and then collapsed, laughing, holding their backs. A boy mimed the swagger of a leopard and tripped over a root, stood, bowed to the amusement of the gathered, learning the first lesson of theatre. When you fall, make it part of the show. Someone found the perfect pebble and declared it lucky, and it was, because now it meant confidence. Someone else imitated the sound of the hyena and got it wrong and invented something funnier than hyenas. In this way, the repertoire of human silliness expanded, and with it, our tolerances for the world's indifference. Biology textbooks won't mention it, but clowning is an adaptation. Night again, and the band makes a small room out of firelight. The flames walk their orange fingers over faces, as if reading them. Sparks lift like prayers, muttered by impatient stars. A pot warms a slurry of tubers and marrow. Not fancy, certainly not gluten-free. Everything was gluten-free, and also gluten-full. Back then, but better than hunger. The conversation has a rhythm, like the surf could have, if the sea were closer. Quiet, then laugh, then quiet again. People lean on each other the way trees lean on wind. Above, a sky so dense with starlight that you could swear the dark was full of holes. Sleep comes the way it often does, in perilous places. Quickly, competently, and with gratitude. You can feel the edges of the next thing, even now, like a pressure change before weather. A hand goes too quickly to a basket of dried meat. A glance lingers where it should pass by. Someone has made a decision that doesn't belong to them alone. The band is a living thing, and like any living thing, it reacts when part of itself behaves like a splinter. The reaction won't come as a siren or a spreadsheet. It will come as a tightened jaw, a whispered consultation near the fire, a long look between the woman who keeps the fire and the man who once got lost and came back. The landscape is beautiful. The landscape is hard. To live here, to live now, means to be exquisitely sensitive to imbalance. And so, though no one wants it, and everyone knew it was always an option, the band begins to consider the word they rarely say aloud because it tastes of smoke and old bones, punishment. Not because they are cruel, but because they cannot afford to pretend that one person's hunger is more sacred than everyone's tomorrow. You may be used to the word justice, arriving in a tuxedo, quoting rules, flanked by architecture, but long before there were pillars to lean against or scrolls to thump, justice pulled up a tree stump and spoke in a whisper. In a small band, with small stomachs and big consequences, the point of punishment wasn't purity. It was survival, logistics. The mathematics were not written, but they were solved daily. If one person takes food that was meant to carry 5 children through a cold front, how many stories continue tomorrow? If someone refuses to tend the fire when it's their turn, and the fire goes out, how many fingers will crack from cold before noon? Public policy, back then, was a pot that either had soup in it or did not. The trick, the problem, the tender wound at the center of it all is that the person who broke the rule is not an extra. They are a cousin, a partner, the one who hums while flaking stones, the one who remembers where the bees made their hive last spring. You cannot banish a limb and expect the body to clap, but you also cannot keep a limb that keeps punching the chest and expect breathing to remain easy. So the band learns to breathe in sentences. The elders take the first sentences, because that's what the title elder includes, along with joint pain and a talent for making everything sound like a proverb. Gathered in firelight, the air has a texture, somehow more visible, like wool combed by light. Everyone settles in that good way people do when they've done this before. No gavel, no gongs. Just faces arranged into the shape of listening. The accused does not stand on a special rock. They sit because everyone sits. The band favors humility that can be achieved with a posture. The elder, with the voice like bark, softened by rain, tells a story. It is not about this theft, this neglect, this broken promise. It's about a time when the river shrank and the fish went clever and the band made a rule about nets and rocks and kindness. The story is a soft hammer. It taps gently at the problem until the grain appears. The little ones watch with their mouths open because the little ones are always collecting techniques. Somewhere in the middle of the story, there will be laughter. An elder will time it consciously, breaking tension before it becomes brittle, reminding everyone that anger is a spear you hold with two hands. Otherwise, it bites both palms. Maybe the accused snorts, surprised at their own smile, and the band notes this like astronomers, noting a meteor, small, fast, meaningful. Humor is not forgiveness, but it is an admission that the future still exists. You cannot laugh if you do not believe in later. Underlying the ritual is a logic so blunt, it's almost tender. In a population this small, you do not have spare people. You do not get a replacement sibling if you break this one. You do not write to a central authority for a shipment of new aunts. Punishment that permanently removes a person is, in effect, self-harm. So the spectrum of consequence leans first toward correction and restitution. You ate from the meat cache before the elders declared it safe. Tomorrow you gather with the unglamorous zeal of a hero who understands that redemption often looks like blisters. You failed your watch and nodded off while the fire sputtered. Your next watches will be public, accompanied by a relentless chorus of gentle teasing, and you will receive from the band 100 jokes that function as stitches. Yes, there are darker blades in the drawer. Exile exists, nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just the quiet decision to sleep elsewhere and walk apart, a reframing of the horizon that tends to end where bones do. And then there are the stories, the ones that curl like smoke around the expression, skinned alive. It would be neat if I could tell you those were only myths born from thunderstorms and the aromatic power of fear. We do not have transcripts, only scattered bones, cut marks that may be ritual or butchery or both, and the knowledge that humans contain the full catalogue of gentleness and its mirror. In a famine, when the horizon dies and the babies cry with that hollow sound that makes the heart want to trade itself for rain, bands do things the future would beg them not to. But in ordinary bad weeks, the usual material of human time, the calculus remains cautious. Keep the person, if the person can be kept, because the group is an ecosystem, and ecosystems dislike subtraction. What made something a crime in the first place? It wasn't about an abstract moral commitment to platonic ideals. It was about resources and roles. Theft of food, sabotage of tools out of jealousy, hoarding information about a water source, refusing to share a skill, violence that did not answer a threat but expressed a mood. You'll notice how modern these charges sound, which is a useful reminder that human nature did not change its ingredients when we invented electricity. What changed were our storage solutions. Back then, instead of a bank account, there was a woven bag hung from a branch. Instead of a fire code, there was the basic insight that sleeping, while the savannah prowls, is a loan you pay back with attention. The clan's law had another important component: timing. They understood the difference between punishment heated to a boil and punishment served warm. They rarely punished immediately at the peak of adrenaline. That is when you say things that make cardboard taste like cherries, satisfying, inexplicable later. They waited until the river of outrage slowed to its honest trickle. By then, they could look at the offender and see not a monster, but a person who failed to resist the same hungry mind. Any of them could have had on a worse afternoon. If there's a Stone Age constitution, it's this sentence murmured across many fires. We are not separate from the mistakes we punish. Spooky, philosophical, and practical as a well-tied knot. How did they keep punishment from becoming spectacle? By refusing to hire an audience. Children were present because childhood is a wild recording device, and what you say near it ends up in the archive, filed under, "This is how we do it." But there was no joy in watching someone bend. If a laugh erupted at the wrong moment, an aunt would deploy that sorcery only aunts possess. A single eyebrow, an entire ethics. Shame was used sparingly. It's a powerful spice and easily ruins the stew. More often, the recipe called for labor and proximity. Work with the person you wronged for 3 days, 4. Fix what you broke, while someone watches who knows what fixed really means. There is a dignity in sweat that rescues people from the swampy place where words alone cannot reach. Of course, personalities complicated the pure math. There was the uncle who loved rules, because rules were the one thing he could lift without his back hurting. There was the young hunter, whose speed sometimes outran his kindness. There was the grandmother who remembered 2 droughts and believed, with the stubbornness of rescued people, that generosity is a water skin you must keep filled, or it grows holes. Negotiating these temperaments was the art form of the band. If the uncle pushed too hard, someone would tell a story about the time he fell asleep in a tree and snored so loudly, a leopard yawned and left. The joke loosened the knot. If the young hunter rolled his eyes, a child would copy the roll, exaggerated, as children do, and the band would laugh the eye roll into harmlessness. If the grandmother grew fierce, they brought her the baby, and the baby pressed its hand to her face, and that was the end of the tribunal for the evening. And those murky stories of skinning, of flaying, of the body turned into warning, let us neither sanitize nor sensationalize. Anthropologists will tell you that ritualized violence appears when groups want to make a memory into an object. Do not do this, says the object, and the future obeys for a little while. In a world with no paper, the body can become a page. It is awful. It is, in certain corners of time and pressure, undeniably human. But the daily reality of punishment most days, most years, looked more like a scolding folded inside a schedule, like sweat paying a debt, like an elder's hand on a shoulder saying, "You are still ours." When sleep finally came, even to the one who'd been wrong, it came because belonging had been bruised, but not amputated. All of this, the gentleness that chose to be firm, the firmness that chose to be kind, arose because small groups do not have the luxury of pretending their members are disposable. Your favorite joke teller may steal once and still be precious. The woman who always knows where the honey is may catch a mean mood and snap at a child and still be the map you need in April. Punishment is the art of reminding the group that it has standards, without convincing the punished that they are a stranger. At the end of a long night of stories and soft arguments and one perfectly timed joke about the moon forgetting to do its shift, the band drifts into that sleep you only get when the worst thing did not happen. The fire, newly assigned its steward and its backup steward and its emergency steward, for if the backup steward sneezes, breathes light into the dark. Somewhere out in that busy theater, the hyena laughs again. The band ignores it. They have their own sound now, the quiet agreement of a group that intends to see mourning together. If you were alive hundreds of thousands of years ago, the first thing people probably noticed about you wasn't your charming personality or your ability to whittle a stick into something vaguely useful. It was your teeth, specifically those wide, flat molars gleaming in the dim glow of a fire, like tiny chunks of ivory lottery tickets wedged into your jaw. Back then, a set of good molars wasn't just a dental perk. It was a life insurance policy. No molars meant no grinding down of tough roots, no chewing fibrous plants, no breaking into the marrow-filled bones that offered precious calories in lean seasons. In short, bad teeth meant you were on the express train to starvation station with no return ticket. A dazzling smile wasn't just about charm, it was about survival. And the definition of dazzling had a lot less to do with whitening strips, and a lot more to do with whether you could pulverize something that tasted like tree bark, but kept you alive through winter. Imagine two hunters sitting around the fire after a long day. One has the prehistoric version of perfect dental health, big, square molars, gleaming with a thin sheen of fat from chewing roasted marrow bones. The other has a mouth full of pain, teeth worn down to nubs, each bite sending lightning bolts of agony through the jaw. Which one do you think everyone else wanted to sit near? Exactly. One man could break open fibrous plants and turn them into usable fuel for the group. The other was the guy who made everyone uncomfortable with his constant grimace and the occasional groan when chewing even a soft berry. Having healthy molars was the Stone Age equivalent of walking into a room with six-pack abs today. It said, loudly and clearly, I am capable, I am healthy, and I can definitely make it through the cold season without being dead weight. And in a world where calories were gold, that was about as attractive as it got. Now, here's where the humor creeps in. In our modern world, we spend billions of dollars on braces, veneers, and professional whitening treatments. In the Stone Age, orthodontics involved being smacked in the mouth by an angry bison, and whitening treatments were provided free of charge by chewing on chalky plants that probably tasted like wet plaster. Your smile wasn't about symmetry or shade. You could have a mouthful of crooked, uneven teeth, as long as your molars looked like they belonged to someone who could chew through a tree branch, if necessary. Function beat fashion, though let's be honest, somewhere, in some firelit cave, someone probably whispered, "Look at her molars, like grinding stones. Beautiful." The science behind all this is surprisingly fascinating. Fossilized skulls tell us that early humans and our cousins, like Neanderthals, had absolutely massive jaws compared to ours. Their molars were huge, wide, and built for industrial-grade chewing. These weren't delicate tools for sipping smoothies. They were crushing machines, the original food processors, and they needed to be. Diets weren't curated with Whole Foods aisles. They were opportunistic and often brutal. Raw plants, stringy meat, gritty grains, and seeds filled with sand, like residue from grinding on stone tools. Every bite was an adventure, and every adventure required molars that could take punishment without crumbling. Today, we break a tooth on a stray popcorn kernel and act like it's the end of the world. Back then, if your molar cracked, you didn't just call the dentist, you became the person who slowly wasted away, unable to keep up with the caloric demands of survival. That's not to say teeth were indestructible. Fossils show heavy wear patterns, grooves cut deep into enamel from decades of chewing tough materials. And yet, despite that wear, many individuals lived long enough to show fully ground down molars, which suggests they endured a life of constant jaw work. Think of it as the ultimate jaw workout plan. No Pilates, no weights, just thousands of hours of chewing your way through meals that would make even the hungriest modern human say, "You know what? I'll pass." And the social importance of teeth went hand in hand with biology. A person with strong molars wasn't just eating for themselves, they were a contributor, a provider. Someone who could crack through nuts, grind fibrous plants, and soften food for the young or the elderly. Their mouth was practically a communal tool. Sharing food wasn't just generous, it was practical. And people with tooth goals were the ones who could handle that role. Let's also appreciate the prehistoric sense of romance here. Today, we swipe right on jawlines and selfies. 900,000 years ago, you might lock eyes with someone across the campfire as they casually tore into a roasted tuber, their molars gleaming with efficiency. That wasn't just hot, it was destiny. Courtship might have been as simple as proving you could chew through something so tough it made everyone else gag. He chewed the bitter root and didn't even cry. Someone would whisper, "He's a keeper." If flowers were ever given in romance back then, they were probably accompanied by the words, "You'll need these petals to soften the roots for me later." But even as we laugh about it, there's a serious undertone. Dental health is one of the clearest markers of overall health in fossil records. When we find skulls with healthy molars, it tells us that person had access to enough nutrition, wasn't ravaged by chronic infections, and had the strength to keep up with the grueling demands of prehistoric life. Conversely, skulls riddled with cavities or worn down prematurely tell us about scarcity, poor diets, or even changing food preparation methods. In fact, one of the great turning points in human history, our shift to agriculture, is marked by a sudden spike in dental problems. Farming introduced softer, starchier foods that clung to teeth and caused decay. Ironically, the invention of bread may have been the downfall of tooth goals. Before that, molars sparkled with pride. After, they were more likely to rot in place. Our ancestors might have been jealous of our microwaves, but they would have pitied our cavities. And here's a thought for your sleepy brain to chew on. Those molars you use now for popcorn and peanut butter sandwiches, they carry the echo of that ancient prestige. When you bite into something tough, you're using tools that once determined who was desirable, who was respected, and who survived. It's funny to imagine, isn't it, that the same body part that makes us self-conscious when we forget to floss was once the Stone Age equivalent of a perfectly tailored suit. Wow, look at the enamel on that guy. Must be from a good family. So, as you drift further into sleep, picture it, a world where the glow of firelight caught the shine of wide, healthy molars, where someone's best feature wasn't their cheekbones, but the grinding stones in their mouth. Imagine those early humans sitting together, laughing at jokes we'll never know, chewing on food we'd never touch, and showing off their teeth with pride. Their smiles weren't polished, but they were powerful. And in the quiet of the night, when the fire had burned low and the stars leaned in close, those molars gleamed like little promises, proof that tomorrow could be survived, and that survival could even look a little dazzling. If you were to time travel back 900,000 years and stroll into a campfire circle, one of the first things you'd notice, after the immediate panic that you're naked, confused, and probably smell like a modern soap aisle, is the brows. Not the brows furrowed in suspicion because you just appeared out of nowhere, but the literal eyebrow ridges looming above those suspicious eyes. These were not dainty little arcs penciled in with care. They were ledges, geological formations squatting on top of the eyes, like the stone lintels of a cave entrance. You could land a small bird on one, and it would have room to roost. To us modern humans, with our comparatively smooth, flat foreheads, these brows look like permanent scowls. Fossil reconstructions of Neanderthals, Homo erectus, and even some of our earlier ancestors always seem like they're angry at you for forgetting to clean the hearth. They look judgmental, stern, perpetually grumpy. But here's the strange twist. Those heavy brows might not have been just bone and accident. They may have been signals. A billboard slapped across the face that screamed strength, resilience, and perhaps, in the right firelight, desirability. Yes, in a world without Instagram filters, without contouring makeup, without hair gel or perfume, your brow ridges were the prehistoric equivalent of a dating profile. Imagine two men squatting by the river, both napping stones into tools. One has the kind of forehead that slopes away like a polished beach pebble. The other has brows jutting forward like a cliff. Which one seems like the better protector? The better hunter? The one less likely to lose a staring contest with a saber-toothed cat? The answer, 9 times out of 10, would be the guy whose brow ridges made him look like he was permanently auditioning for the role of angry god of thunder. Now, scientists have argued about these ridges for decades. Were they structural? Did they help absorb chewing forces? Since jaws back then were basically industrial crushers, chewing through roots, marrow, and uncooperative animal parts. Or were they communicative, a kind of facial flag system? Recent studies lean toward both. Yes, the ridges helped distribute the stress of massive chewing forces, but they also made expressions more dramatic. Eyebrow ridges could magnify the scowl, sharpen the glare, and make subtle shifts in dominance crystal clear across a firelit cave. Think of them as prehistoric emojis carved directly into the skull. For attraction, it gets even weirder. Those big brows might have been sexy. Picture this. 2 women sit by the fire, gossiping over roasted tubers. One says, "Did you see Korg today? Carried that deer back alone." The other replies, "Yes. And did you notice his brow ridges? Like mountains, at sunset." I swoon. A third woman, eavesdropping, adds, "I like a smooth forehead myself. Less likely to look mad when I tell him he's on baby duty." And there you have it. Eyebrow ridges weren't just bones. They were social debate topics. But like all attractive traits, they had a dark side. Heavy brows made you look strong. Yes, they also made you look terrifying when you weren't trying. Imagine being a Stone Age toddler, and your dad looks down at you with what, in modern lighting, appears to be a death stare. You spill a bit of marrow soup, and suddenly those ridges seem like cliffs, overhanging a bottomless canyon of fury. Dad isn't angry. He's just existing. But good luck explaining that to your frightened child brain. Those ridges made everyone look like they were silently judging your life choices. Of course, some anthropologists suggest the ridges also played a role in keeping sweat and rain out of the eyes, a kind of built-in gutter system. Romantic? Not really. Practical? Absolutely. You can't impress your tribe with a mammoth kill if you keep blinking sweat into your eyes and tripping over roots. Function and attraction went hand in hand, and the eyebrows carried both burdens with ease. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, lost these heavy ridges as our skulls reshaped into the rounder, flatter versions you see in the mirror. Our foreheads ballooned forward to make space for big, complicated brains. And with that expansion, the giant shelf brows slowly disappeared. But the echo of them lingers in how we still treat eyebrows as emotional megaphones. Raise them, and you're surprised. Lower them, and you're angry. Wiggle them, and you're flirting, or just being creepy, depending on the circumstances. Our ancestors had that same repertoire, only cranked up to 11 by bone architecture, that would put modern fashion models out of business. It's almost comedic to imagine how much these ridges dominated the the social theatre of prehistoric life. A rival approaches your waterhole, and you don't have to shout or wave a spear, you just tilt your head down. Let the firelight shadow your brow, and boom, instant intimidation. It's Batman's cowl, built in. You want to woo someone. Sit in profile, so your brow catches the light, making you look like a heroic figure carved in stone. You want to seem unthreatening? Good luck. You could be singing lullabies and still look like you're auditioning for the role of disappointed executioner. And yet, despite the comedy, it mattered. Prehistoric survival wasn't just about muscles, it was about signals. The ability to show dominance, attract mates, warn rivals, and reassure allies without words was life-saving. Brow ridges provided that stage. They exaggerated everything. A small smile looked bigger. A small frown looked deadly. In a world where misunderstandings could end with spears flying, clarity of expression was not just handy, it was necessary. So the next time you're tweezing your brows or filling them in with makeup, think of your ancestors. They didn't tweeze. They didn't contour. Their brows were bone thrones of dominance, permanent helmets of expression. They were unchangeable, undeniable, and oddly beautiful in their brutality. A Neanderthal striding across a valley might not have had perfect skin or straight teeth, but those ridges told the story. Here is someone who survives, someone who endures, someone who looks perpetually angry, because that's what the bones decided. And who are you to argue with bones? And if you're lying there now, eyelids getting heavy, smile at the thought. Somewhere in your genetic past is a lineage of lovers and fighters who measured attractiveness not by cheekbone angles or jawlines, but by the mighty ridges above their eyes. It's ridiculous, but it's also tender in a strange way, because those ridges, for all their ferocity, carried humanity through ice ages, droughts, and hungry nights. They scowled their way into the future, until one day, a descendant of theirs sat down and said, "What if I shaved these things off? So sleep easy tonight, knowing your forehead is a smooth monument to change." But your distant cousins would have looked at it and said, "That's cute, but where are your ridges?" Let's slip back into that firelit world, where the stars leaned close like curious eyes, and the nights were long enough to make you feel like time itself had teeth. Picture yourself among a band of 30, maybe 40 people, all the human beings you know and trust. Every face is familiar. Every laugh is a thread in the fabric of your life. In such a small circle, every action matters, which brings us to crime. Yes, even in the Stone Age, long before lawyers wore wigs and judges banged gavels, people had rules. They might not have been written down, because writing was a few 100,000 years away, but they were etched into memory, into story, into the kind of look an elder gives you when you've done something wrong. What counted as crime? Not murder mysteries or bank robberies, because there were no banks, and frankly, if you killed someone, the tribe already knew who did it. You were all sleeping shoulder to shoulder. Instead, crime was the kind of thing that threatened the delicate balance of survival. Stealing food was probably at the top of the list. Imagine a hard winter, bellies growling like wolves, and someone sneaks into the meat cache and takes a chunk meant to feed everyone. That wasn't just selfishness. That was gambling with the group's survival. It was the equivalent of draining the battery of your only flashlight in a cave, just because you wanted to look at your own shadow puppets. It put everyone at risk. Then there was lying. Not the playful lies about whether you'd really seen a mammoth with tusks as long as the river, but lies that distorted the group's ability to survive. If you claimed the hunting grounds were safe when they weren't, or said the nearby spring still had water when it was bone dry, you weren't just fibbing, you were steering the tribe toward hunger or danger. That was a crime as real as theft. In a way, dishonesty was a kind of sabotage. Imagine the eye rolls if you shouted, "Mammoth," over that hill, and everyone ran with spears, only to find a very annoyed rhinoceros. A lie in the Stone Age wasn't just annoying, it could be fatal. It's one thing to embellish a story around the fire, another to send your entire family into a lion's mouth because you wanted attention. There were other crimes too. Neglecting duties was high up there. If it was your turn to watch the fire and you nodded off, that wasn't just a personal failure. It could mean the flames died, leaving the entire group huddling in cold and darkness, with predators circling. Forgetting to tend the fire wasn't like forgetting to put the bins out. It was like cutting the electric line to an entire village. Everyone noticed. And then there were acts of violence, striking someone in anger without reason. Now, arguments were natural, of course, but the group couldn't afford people who brought chaos into the circle. If disputes spiraled too far, it risked breaking apart the fragile unity of the band. So even a hot temper could become a crime if it jeopardized the group's harmony. Humor found its way into all this too. There's no doubt that jokes about crime circulated. You can almost hear someone teasing, "Better watch your meat, or old Garuk will sniff it out like a wolf," followed by a round of laughter, everyone knowing Garuk had once been caught with greasy fingers near the drying rack. Laughter softened the edges, turned minor offenses into community lessons. But the serious line was clear. Anything that endangered survival food, fire, trust, was crime. You didn't need prisons filled with thousands. You just needed 30 people who understood that rules weren't about morality, they were about tomorrow. Punishments, then, were carefully balanced. Sometimes it was mockery, sometimes extra duties, sometimes exclusion from certain privileges, like the first bite of fresh meat. The harshest penalties, banishment, or even violence were rare, because in a world where every hand was precious, losing a member of the group was almost like amputating a limb. Yet the shadow of harsh punishment lingered as a warning, told in whispers around the fire. Don't steal meat. Don't lie about mammoths, or you may end up remembered as the one who tested the patience of the tribe too far. And with that thought, let's walk quietly from the crimes to the accused, the prisoner, sitting by the fire with all eyes on them. Enter the prisoner, being locked up in the Stone Age was never about iron bars or padlocks. There was no dungeon with chains, no underground cell. Your prison was social. Your cell was the weight of every eye in the group watching you, the tension in every silence, the distance that opened between you and the circle when food was passed around. Isolation wasn't just lonely, it was terrifying. You relied on those people for warmth, for food, for protection. To be marked as wrong was to feel the chill of the night pressing close, even while you sat in the middle of the campfire's glow. A day in the life of such a prisoner began the same way as everyone else's. Waking up in the half-light, breath fogging in the cold air, stretching sore muscles on a bed of hides or straw. But the difference lay in how the group looked at you. They didn't ignore you. Ignoring would have been mercy, but they watched. When food was divided, you might get your portion last, after everyone else had been served. When tools were handed out for the day's work, yours might be the dull scraper, the chipped spear. The message was clear: you were on the edge. And though they might still laugh at your jokes, the laughter carried a sting, a reminder that you were being measured. Your tasks might be harsher too. If you had stolen meat, you'd be given gathering duty, trudging long distances for firewood, or digging in hard ground for roots. Watched closely to ensure you didn't pocket extra. If you'd lied about a mammoth sighting, you'd be sent scouting, but paired with someone who trusted you just enough to make sure you didn't wander off. The punishment wasn't always the pain of a whip or the cut of a blade. It was the constant reminder that your actions had consequences, and the community was testing whether you could be trusted again. There was humor even here, though. Someone might call out, "Don't tell us you saw another mammoth, liar," and everyone would laugh, including you, though your cheeks burned. That laughter was both punishment and medicine. If you could laugh at yourself, maybe you could be welcomed back. If you sulked, if you resisted, if you grew angry, then the tribe's patience would fray. Nights were the hardest. While others drifted into sleep, comforted by the warmth of shared blankets and shared trust, you lay awake, listening to the fire crackle, to the coughs and snores of your people, wondering if tomorrow would be your last chance. You watched the shadows crawl along the cave walls, and felt as though they were whispering your guilt. In a world where belonging was everything, the silent fear of exile was punishment enough. Sometimes, though, the prisoner found redemption. A stolen piece of meat was repaid by a successful hunt, offered first to the tribe as a gesture of loyalty. A liar redeemed themselves by scouting true, leading the tribe to water when thirst threatened. A fire neglected was repaid by nights of careful tending, eyes red from smoke, body stiff from sleeplessness. Punishment was not just to make you suffer, it was to give you the chance to prove that you still belonged, that your hands were still useful, that your presence was still worth the food you ate. And so the prisoner's day was lived in a strange space, caught between guilt and hope, between laughter that cut and laughter that forgave, locked not by stone or iron, but by the fragile, binding threads of community. And as the fire burned low and the prisoner's eyes closed at last, the question lingered: would tomorrow bring forgiveness, or the long walk, alone into the dark? There is a particular weight to certain phrases in human history. "Skinned alive" is one of them. It lands heavy, like a club dropped into silence, raising goosebumps, even if you're safe in bed. For people living 900,000 years ago, the phrase would have been more than words. It would have been a living terror, whispered in stories and threats, a punishment that could haunt the imagination far more effectively than a spear wound or a broken bone. To understand why the myth mattered, you have to picture the scale of life back then. A tribe wasn't thousands, it wasn't even hundreds. It was 30, maybe 40 souls, clinging to existence around a fire. Each person was precious, yet each person was a potential liability. In such close quarters, where survival balanced on a knife edge of food, warmth, and cooperation, betrayal of trust had consequences bigger than the act itself. If someone stole food, they weren't just greedy, they were putting children at risk. If someone lied about where the herds had gone, it wasn't just mischief, it could send hunters into danger and bring back empty hands. So when people whispered about being skinned alive, it was less about sadism and more about scale. They needed punishments that could strike terror into the heart, that could make every child shiver and every adult pause before doing something reckless. In that sense, the myth was a weapon, sharp as flint, designed not to kill, but to prevent. But did it actually happen? Archaeology gives us tantalizing clues. Cut marks on bones, some carefully placed, suggest rituals of defleshing. Most researchers believe those marks were linked to funerary customs, the preparation of bodies for burial or spiritual ceremonies. Yet, in the shadows of interpretation, one can't help but wonder if at least some of those marks might have belonged to the brutal theatre of punishment. Later, civilizations certainly embraced the practice. The Assyrians carved images of enemies being flayed into stone reliefs, their artistry forever memorializing cruelty. The Aztecs wore human skins in religious rituals, transforming punishment into performance. If later societies were capable of it, it isn't impossible that earlier ones, under pressure, might have invented their own versions. Even if they didn't, the imagination doesn't need much help. The mere suggestion of losing your skin, the body's largest organ, your visible shield against the world, was enough to make anyone sit up straighter. You could live with a limp, survive with missing fingers, but without skin, that was worse than death. It was the annihilation of identity. In myth, to be skinned alive wasn't only to be killed, it was to be erased, turned into a living warning, draped before the firelight. Humor, strange as it seems, probably danced around the edges of this horror. People have always used jokes to dull the sharpness of fear. You can almost imagine a hunter teasing a friend, "Don't sneak an extra bite, or we'll take that handsome hide of yours." Everyone would laugh nervously, half relieved it was just a joke, half reminded that even jokes live in the shadow of truth. The laughter bonded them together, but it also reinforced the lesson. Rules mattered, and consequences were waiting. It's easy for us, cushioned by laws and rights and heating systems, to call this barbaric. And, of course, it was. But for people who woke every morning with predators circling and winter always approaching, the brutal myth of skinning alive was practical psychology. It kept everyone on the same page, made sure trust wasn't broken, and ensured survival for the group as a whole. So whether it happened once, or 1,000 times, or never at all, hardly matters. What mattered was that people believed it could happen. Belief was the cage. Belief was the lash. In the dark hours of the night, when the fire burned low and whispers crept like smoke, the myth was enough. And if the myth was enough to keep the group alive, then, in its cruel way, it worked. Now the question lingers, like smoke after the fire. Why? Why would human beings invent punishments so terrifying, so grotesque, that even the words echo down through thousands of years and make us shiver in our beds? The answer isn't simple cruelty. It lies in fear, superstition, and the desperate need to survive together. Fear was the most honest companion of the Stone Age. It followed people everywhere. Fear of predators, fear of hunger, fear of the cold. In such a world, fear wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Fear kept you alive when you heard branches snap in the darkness. Fear made you stockpile roots for winter. Fear taught you to be careful with fire. Communities learned to wield fear the way they wielded spears, as a tool. By creating punishments that lived in the imagination, they extended the reach of fear into behavior. Fear didn't just keep lions at bay, it kept selfishness at bay too. A whisper about being flayed could stop a hungry hand from sneaking into the meat rack. In this way, fear wasn't cruelty, it was governance. Then came superstition. In a world without science, cause and effect were mysteries wrapped in fog. Why did the rains fail? Why did disease strike? Why did the hunt come back empty? Explanations often rested in spirits, gods, or invisible forces that demanded respect. If someone broke the tribe's rules, it wasn't just a personal failing. It might anger those forces. Punishment, then, wasn't only about teaching the guilty. It was about appeasing the unseen. A brutal sentence was a kind of offering, proof to the spirits that order had been restored. that the tribe was willing to pay blood to buy back harmony. Imagine the relief of a fearful group, convinced that by punishing harshly, they had shielded themselves from drought or misfortune. In their minds, the cost of cruelty was smaller than the cost of cosmic anger. And finally, there was survival. This is the thread tying everything together. In bands so small, where losing one member could tip the balance between life and death, discipline wasn't optional. Cooperation was oxygen. Punishment was the stitching that kept the social fabric from tearing. Brutality, in this light, wasn't about sadism, but efficiency. A group could not afford repeated theft, chronic lying, or violence that fractured trust. They didn't have prisons, they didn't have rehabilitation programs, they didn't have spare resources to tolerate constant failure. What they had was the imagination of terror. If one threat of skinning alive prevented a dozen thefts, then the cruel math was worth it. Humor crept into this equation too, because humans are incapable of surviving on fear alone. Around the fire, someone might quip about spirits demanding not just a goat, but your favorite cousin's hide. Everyone would laugh. Even the cousin, though uneasily. The laughter didn't erase the fear, but it made it livable. It's always been that way. We laugh about what terrifies us, because laughter is a release valve, letting out enough pressure to keep us from exploding. Fear and humor dance together, one keeping order, the other keeping sanity. It's important to remember that most punishments weren't brutal. Most were small. Extra duties, mockery, social shaming. But the stories of flaying, of horror, lingered because they worked. They didn't need to happen often. They needed only to be believed. The tribe carried the myth forward, whispering it to children, repeating it during tense moments, invoking it when temptation loomed. Over generations, the myth became bigger than the act itself, a shadow cast across centuries. Why did they do it? Because they had to. Because fear was cheaper than chaos, superstition was stronger than ignorance, and survival was worth almost any price. They were not monsters. They were us, stripped to the bone, by necessity, finding ways to keep 30 people alive in a world that wanted them dead. And as you close your eyes tonight, lying in warmth, surrounded by locks and laws and rights that those people never dreamed of, you can feel a strange gratitude. Their myths, their fears, their cruel inventions, they worked well enough to carry us here. They paid the price in dread so that we could pay ours in comfort. Sleep comes easier when you realize that even in their darkest inventions, our ancestors weren't celebrating cruelty. They were clinging to survival and clinging to each other, the only way they knew how. Humor amid horror is one of those strange paradoxes that has followed humanity since we first gathered around flames. Even in the darkest of moments, there's always that one person, the cousin, the aunt, the hunter, with a lopsided grin, who cracks a joke that sends the whole camp into uneasy laughter. The Stone Age was no exception. In fact, in some ways, it may have been more important back then than it is now. When a trial of sorts unfolded in a small band, when someone had broken a taboo or stolen from the meat rack or shirked fire duty, it wasn't a court with solemn robes and serious expressions. It was more like a group roast. Yes, your life might be on the line, your status in the tribe dangling by a thread, but you were also about to be hit with a barrage of jokes about your clumsiness, your smelly hide shirt, or the fact that last week you tried to flirt and got rejected by someone who smelled worse than a rotting mammoth. Picture it, 30 people huddled in the glow of firelight, the accused sitting in the center, trying to look appropriately remorseful, but not too pathetic. The elders begin with heavy words, words that carry the gravity of survival. But soon, inevitably, someone slips in a quip. He says he didn't steal the marrow bones, but his breath smells like soup. The tribe erupts in laughter. The accused blushes, maybe tries to hide a smile, because it's true everyone saw him wiping grease from his chin the night before. That laughter does more than lighten the mood. It stitches the group back together, reminding them that even in conflict, they share the same rhythm of humor. These roast sessions weren't just cruelty disguised as comedy. They were medicine. When tempers run hot in a group that size, things can fracture fast. A scolding can harden into resentment. Resentment can turn into violence. And in a band of 30, one knife in the dark can spell disaster for everyone. But laughter cools the blood. It transforms anger into amusement, frustration into community teasing. It makes the punishment memorable without being unbearable. It allows the accused to rejoin the group without carrying shame so heavy it crushes them. If everyone has laughed together, even at your expense, then the punishment is shared. You're not being pushed outside the circle. You're being nudged back into it with a grin. Think of the difference between silence and laughter. Silence in a trial is terrifying. Every glance feels sharp, every breath heavy, every decision final. But laughter is forgiving. It says, yes, you did wrong, but you are still one of us. You're still the butt of our jokes, which is another way of saying, you still belong. The very cruelty of the humor, the fact that they roast you mercilessly, is evidence of love. If they didn't care, they wouldn't bother joking. They'd just exile you, or worse. Humor was proof that there was still space for you in the group. And, of course, the jokes themselves became lessons for the children. Imagine a 6-year-old giggling while their uncle gets roasted for laziness. They file the memory away. Don't skip fire duty, or the tribe will never let you live it down. Those jokes became warnings, soft enough to laugh at, but sharp enough to stick in the mind. It was public shaming wrapped in laughter, discipline softened with absurdity. In this way, the Stone Age trial was a masterclass in psychology. They knew that pain alone didn't teach. What taught was a story everyone could remember, a joke retold around the fire for years. And it wasn't just one-sided. The accused could fight back gently, of course with their own humor. A clever quip could tilt sympathy back in their favor. A self-deprecating remark could show humility and win forgiveness. The trial was not just punishment, but theater. Everyone watched, everyone participated, everyone laughed. It was survival wrapped in entertainment, horror tempered by hilarity. And when the fire died down, when the stars pressed close, the group settled into sleep, not divided by anger, but united by laughter, the memory of the roast glowing warmer than the embers themselves. The role of elders is often painted in soft tones, wise voices, echoing through time. But in the Stone Age, it was more than poetry. Elders were the backbone of order, the living archives of rules and stories that kept a fragile band from falling apart. They didn't write laws in ink. They spoke them in tales, in parables, in songs whispered to children, drifting into sleep. To live without writing meant living in memory, and elders were memory incarnate. Imagine a winter night, the cold clawing at the door of the cave, frost gathering along the walls. The fire burns low, every spark precious. The tribe huddles close, eyes heavy, but spirits uneasy after a theft or a fight. The elder clears his throat, the sound creaking like an old tree in the wind. Everyone quiets. He doesn't accuse anyone directly, at least not at first. He tells a story. Maybe it's about a hunter from seasons long gone, a man who thought he could hoard meat for himself. The elder describes how that man grew greedy, how he slipped into shadows to steal, how he thought he was clever. The children lean in. The adults exchange glances. Everyone knows who the story is really about, but the lesson isn't delivered as a hammer. It's given as a tale, wrapped in images and memory, easy to swallow, impossible to forget. By the end, when the elder describes how the greedy hunter faced ruin, the group feels both warned and comforted. The wrongdoer knows the story is for them, but they don't feel singled out. They feel woven into a fabric larger than themselves. Elders had authority not because they could swing the heaviest club, but because they carried the weight of remembered winters. They could say, "I have seen the river dry before, and here is how we lived." They could whisper, "I remember when a man struck his brother and how the tribe nearly broke." These stories weren't abstract. They were survival manuals, cautionary tales that doubled as community glue. The young learned rules, not by lecture, but by legend. Every act of disobedience or failure became a story, retold until it became law. But it wasn't all solemn. Elders knew when to soften lessons with humor, when to turn punishment into parable, and parable into laughter. A forgetful boy might be reminded of the tale of the man who tried to chase a deer naked and ended up with frostbite on his backside. Everyone laughs, but the lesson is clear. Prepare, clothe yourself, respect the cold. In this way, elders kept order without crushing spirit. They made rules memorable by making them funny. They knew that a well-placed chuckle could keep a warning alive for generations longer than any scolding ever could. Their voices bridged the gap between fear and hope. When a tribe felt the weight of hunger, the elders' story reminded them they had survived worse. When conflict threatened to fracture the group, the elders' parable reminded them that unity was life. When a child wondered why they couldn't sneak food from the fire, the elders' tale of spirits watching from the shadows instilled caution deeper than any slap could. They carried the laws not in scrolls, but in rhythm, repetition, and performance. In the absence of paper, storytelling was the ink of survival. And when the fire burned low and eyelids drooped, the elder's voice became lullaby. Children slept with stories still echoing in their dreams, rules stitched into their minds, alongside images of heroes and fools. Adults rested easier, knowing that tomorrow the group would wake, not only with full bellies, but with order intact. Storytelling wasn't entertainment, it was civilization itself. Without elders, rules faded. With them, rules lived on, sharp as flint, warm as firelight. Alternative punishments were the meat and bone of everyday justice in the Stone Age. The truly horrific stuff, the whispered threats of flaying or death, were rare, almost mythical in their intensity. Day to day, people relied on tools that were practical, effective, and sometimes embarrassingly funny. You can almost see the faces in the firelight, trying to keep straight expressions as someone is sentenced to spend a week hauling dung to the edge of the camp. It wasn't glamorous, but it was memorable. The first alternative, exile, carried a gravity unlike any other. To us, being asked to leave might mean renting a new apartment or starting over in a different city. For a prehistoric human, exile was a death sentence written in softer ink. Alone on the savannah, you became prey. The hyenas laughed louder, the cold night sank deeper, and no one was there to help keep the fire alive. Sometimes exile was temporary, a sharp reminder that your survival depended on belonging. Other times, it was permanent, and the figure who left the circle never returned. Even when it was temporary, the lesson carved itself deep into the soul. The terror of silence without the tribe, of staring at the stars with no one beside you, was punishment enough to remind you never to break trust again. But exile was costly. Every person carried skills, memories, and strength the group couldn't easily replace. So most punishments leaned toward mockery, a far cheaper currency. Humor, after all, is one of humanity's most enduring weapons. If you lied about a hunt, if you sneaked extra food, the punishment might come as relentless teasing. Every time you spoke, someone would interrupt. Is this like the last time you saw a mammoth? Or can we believe you now? The group would laugh, and you would flush, and the sting of embarrassment would do the work of 100 lashes. Mockery was efficient. It left no scars on the body, but it branded you in memory. And because laughter is contagious, the punishment echoed. Children giggled, adults smirked, and the lesson carried itself into the next generation. Then there were the chores. Punishment often meant being buried in work nobody else wanted to do. Dung collecting was a classic, not just because it was unpleasant, but because it was necessary. Fires needed fuel, and in treeless plains, dried dung burned hot and steady. To be sentenced to dung duty meant endless walks under the sun, gathering the droppings of animals and stacking them into piles. It smelled, it stained, and it humbled. Imagine someone once proud and defiant, reduced to trudging behind the herd with a grimace, hands full of something no one wanted to touch. It was comedy and consequence rolled together, and it reminded everyone that punishment didn't have to draw blood. It could simply wear down pride. Other punishments included loss of privilege. The first taste of fresh meat after a hunt was a prize everyone cherished. To deny someone that taste was a way of saying, you are part of us, but you must feel the weight of your wrong. Sitting on the edge of the circle while others chewed, waiting your turn, felt heavier than it looked. In a world of constant hunger, food was language. Being served last was as cutting as any insult. Sometimes, punishment was service. The guilty might be assigned to repair tools, fetch water, guard the fire through the coldest part of the night. None of these things were unbearable, but they were constant reminders. As long as your hands worked, they told the group, I am repaying my debt. I am re-earning my place. The beauty of these punishments was that they didn't waste lives. They corrected without destroying. They made the group stronger by teaching lessons while keeping the family intact. And always, there was the chorus of memory. People didn't forget easily. Once punished, you carried a story. Years later, by another fire, someone would laugh and say, remember when you were caught snoring while on watch? We almost froze that night. Everyone would laugh again, and you would too, even if your ears burned. In that way, punishment became a story, a piece of law that strengthened the tribe's culture. It was both warning and entertainment, keeping rules alive without needing scrolls or stones. So exile, mockery, dung collection, these weren't just alternatives to brutality. They were the everyday backbone of justice, lighter than death, but heavy enough to keep people walking straight. They carried humor and shame in equal measure, proof that even in the harshest times, humans preferred to laugh their way back into order rather than bleed their way out of it. The psychology of fear runs like a quiet stream under every part of early human life. To survive in groups so small, fear had to be sharpened into a tool. It wasn't only about lions lurking beyond the firelight or the icy winds creeping down from the mountains. Fear was also how groups kept themselves together. It was the invisible wall, the whispered guardrail, the shadow that reminded you not to step too far from the circle. Fear began with nature. When the night stretched endlessly and the cries of predators echoed across the plains, fear taught caution. Children learned early, don't wander, don't stray, don't ignore the crack of branches. But fear also seeped into the rules of the tribe. Breaking trust was dangerous, not just because it angered people, but because it threatened the entire fragile web of survival. So fear of punishment, mockery, exile, or worse, became as important as fear of predators. It reminded everyone that disobedience carried risks beyond embarrassment. Elders wielded fear with care, shaping it into stories. They told of spirits watching from the darkness, of curses that followed thieves, of eyes that never closed. To children, these stories were more than bedtime tales. They were warnings folded into myth, teaching that every act had unseen consequences. Fear of spirits made rules harder to break, because you weren't only disappointing people, you were offending forces you couldn't see. In a world without microscopes or meteorology, the unseen was vast and powerful. To believe that spirits punished wrongdoers gave structure to chaos. But fear wasn't only superstition. It was also practical psychology. If you knew the cost of stealing was humiliation, exile, or worse, fear held your hand back. If you saw others punished, the memory imprinted on your mind. You laughed with the crowd, but somewhere inside, fear carved its lesson. The group didn't need guards or chains. They needed stories, rituals, and the steady presence of fear. It kept order cheaply, without wasting strength. Of course, fear wasn't just inflicted from above. It was shared horizontally, woven through gossip, teasing, and jokes. Someone might laugh about how a liar was once chased by spirits into the cold. The laughter softened the story, but the fear lingered. That mix of humor and terror was effective. The laughter made the lesson palatable. The fear made it unforgettable. It was the Stone Age version of the carrot and stick, with the carrot being community and the stick being terror wrapped in myth. Even daily routines carried quiet fear. Watching the fire wasn't just a chore. It was a responsibility heavy with dread. Letting the fire die wasn't simply laziness. It could mean death for everyone. Fear of being the one blamed for cold, hunger, or predator attack was enough to keep eyes open long past exhaustion. The psychology of fear ensured vigilance. It made each person careful, because each mistake could ripple outward into tragedy. Fear also strengthened bonds. Knowing that exile meant almost certain death, people clung harder to the circle. Fear of isolation was perhaps the strongest fear of all. Alone, you were prey. Together, you were a wall of eyes, ears, and spears. Fear of leaving kept people inside, and fear of punishment kept them aligned. Survival was never guaranteed, but fear made it likelier. And yet, there was a strange tenderness to it. Fear wasn't always cruel. It was protective. The fear your mother instilled in you when she told you not to wander. The fear your elders planted with their tales. The fear the group taught with mockery. It all had the same root. They feared losing you. They feared the collapse of the fragile circle. Fear was their love language, sharpened by necessity. So when you drift towards sleep, hearing the ancient laughter of trial roasts and the heavy words of elders in your imagination, remember that fear was not just a shadow, it was a guardian. It walked beside our ancestors, warning them, guiding them, keeping them alive long enough to give birth to us. Fear was the silent tool that carved order out of chaos, a ghostly teacher that whispered, "Stay close, stay honest, stay alive." Daily life in a Stone Age prison was not the glamorous tale of iron bars and stern wardens that later history would produce. There were no dank dungeons carved beneath castles, no echoing chains dragging across stone floors. A prison then was a patch of dirt, a cold cave corner, or a symbolic circle of bodies who had decided that for now you were not free. You were separated, not by walls, but by the weight of shame and the gaze of everyone you had once called family. And yet, even in its crude simplicity, it was still a prison. Imagine waking in the half-light of dawn, when mist clings to the earth like a second skin. Normally, you would roll over to the warmth of other sleeping bodies, the comfort of shared hides, the safety of community heat. But not now. You are on the edge. They've placed you away from the fire, not far enough to freeze, but far enough that you know you are no longer welcome in the center. The air is sharp in your lungs, and your stomach growls, not just from hunger, but from dread. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was not a warm bowl of stew or roasted meat. No one brought you a carefully portioned meal. Instead, you ate what was tossed your way, scraps of roots, a gristly bone, or, if you were unlucky, nothing at all. More often than not, you were expected to scavenge. Bugs were plentiful, crawling in every crevice. Grubs, fat and wriggling, offered protein, even if they wriggled back in protest as you popped them between your teeth. Ants, if collected in handfuls, had a sour tang. Termites could be shaken out of mounds with patience. Eating bugs wasn't shameful in itself. Everyone did it when times were lean, but as prison fare, it was constant, relentless, and humiliating. You weren't trusted with the tribe's good food. You were left to chew what even children turned their noses at. Hygiene in prison was no kinder. Without companions to pick through your hair for lice or scratch your back when fleas attacked, you endured constant itching. Nights were spent writhing, trying to reach spots your fingers couldn't, while imagining your free comrades enjoying the simple luxury of grooming each other by the fire. You smelled of sweat and smoke, of dust and insect shells. You looked unkempt, which in a community where appearance was red as health, was a punishment in itself. Every scratch reminded you not just of discomfort, but of distance and the boredom. This was perhaps the cruelest element of all. There was no work assigned that made you feel purposeful, no weaving of nets, no shaping of stone blades. They didn't want your hands crafting, because crafting was a sign of trust. They didn't want your voice in council, because your words carried no weight. You were left idle. No Netflix marathons to pass the time. No books. No distractions. You stared at the walls of your cave corner, at the same cracks, in the same rocks, until they seemed to move. You counted the steps from your spot to the fire, from the fire to the entrance, back again, again, again. You watched the smoke curl upward in hypnotic patterns, inventing faces in it, whispering stories, only to yourself. The loneliness bit deeper than hunger. You heard laughter and conversation echo through the camp, jokes and arguments, gossip and plans. You were excluded from it all. People didn't ignore you entirely. That would have been too kind. They let you feel their stares, their deliberate pauses when you approached, the sudden quiet that fell when you tried to join in. You weren't invisible. You were glaringly, painfully visible in your absence from the circle. And yet, within this grim routine, there were moments of absurdity. Sometimes a child would sneak close, wide-eyed, curious about the bad man or bad woman everyone was talking about. They might toss a pebble at you or giggle before running back. Sometimes, someone with a soft heart, an older sibling, an aunt, would slip you a piece of fruit or a strip of meat, pretending they had dropped it by accident. These moments were small, but they carried the weight of survival. Daily life in prison wasn't torture in the way we think of it now. It was worse. In a way, it was a slow, gnawing erosion of dignity. You didn't scream in agony. You sighed in despair. You didn't bleed. You itched. You didn't die outright, but you withered in silence, watching your people live the life you longed to rejoin. Every bug chewed, every flea scratch, every hour of empty staring was a reminder you had broken trust. And until you proved yourself worthy, this was your world. Escape attempts were, by contrast, the moments of unexpected comedy in this bleak landscape. If daily life in Stone Age prison was monotony and shame, then escape was slapstick theatre, often doomed, sometimes tragic, but always remembered. Picture a man crouched in the shadows, trying to sneak past guards who were nothing more than his cousins armed with rocks. The guards weren't trained soldiers. They were teenagers, bored out of their minds, half distracted, occasionally throwing pebbles at each other for sport. And yet, they carried the authority of the circle, which made them formidable in the prisoner's mind. The first step in any escape was timing. Night offered darkness, but also predators. Sneak out at dusk, and a leopard might finish the job of punishment before the tribe even noticed you'd gone. Daylight was safer from animals, but hopeless against the tribe's constant surveillance. So the would-be escapee had to choose between being mauled by lions or caught by laughter. Neither was appealing, but desperation is a strong motivator. Imagine him now, belly pressed to the dirt, inching forward. He thinks he's silent, a shadow in the grass. But his knees crack, his breath comes loud, and the fleas he's been harboring choose that moment to itch unbearably. He wriggles, slaps at his leg, curses under his breath. The guards hear him and chuckle. They don't even move at first, just whisper to each other, placing bets on how far he'll get before tripping. Finally, they pick up stones and toss them not to injure, but to humiliate. A pebble bounces off his back. Another grazes his ankle. The laughter grows, echoing through the camp. His grand escape is already a story, and he hasn't even made it 10 paces. Some escapees tried distraction. A sudden shout, "Look, mammoth," only to realize no one is fooled. Or they might throw a rock into the bushes, hoping the noise draws attention, but everyone knows the trick. Worse, the noise might attract a real predator, which meant the guards laughed even harder while nudging each other toward the safety of the fire. The prisoner, now exposed, slunk back to their corner, humiliated but alive. Others tried bribery. "Let me go," they'd whisper, "and I'll bring back honey, or firewood, or meat." Sometimes a young guard, tempted, might consider it. But the risk was high, and the reward uncertain. More often than not, the bribery failed, and the attempt became fodder for more mockery. Remember when Garrick offered me a handful of beetles to let him sneak away, as if I'd risk the elder's wrath for bugs? The story would be retold for years, long after Garrick had served his time. And yet, not every attempt was laughable. Some succeeded, slipping into the night and never returning. Survival on their own was rare, but not impossible. Some may have found another band, weaving themselves into a new circle. Others may have perished, their bones gnawed by animals, their stories whispered as warnings. But the majority failed, and failure was spectacle. Escape attempts were a reminder to everyone, prisoner and guard alike, of the futility of going it alone. They reinforced the lesson that exile was death and community was life. They also provided moments of levity, absurd little dramas that entertained the group while teaching discipline. Children learned not to run from problems by watching adults fail hilariously at running from punishment. Adults learned patience, realizing that endurance within the circle was safer than bravado outside it. The psychology of these escapes wasn't just about freedom, it was about hope. Even knowing the odds, the prisoner dreamed of grasslands without mockery, of nights without shame. That dream was powerful enough to make them crawl through dirt, to risk laughter and stones, to endure humiliation for the chance of something else. Hope, even when hopeless, is stubborn. It keeps crawling, scratching, inching forward, and sometimes, just sometimes, it makes it past the guards with rocks. Group dynamics in the Stone Age were not just about who could throw the farthest spear, or who could sniff out tubers under a frozen crust of soil. They were about a delicate, constantly shifting balance between cooperation and conflict, trust and suspicion, laughter and silence. When you lived in a band of 30 or 40 people, there were no strangers to blame, no distant neighbors to gossip about. Every face around the fire was familiar. Every hand that passed you food was one you depended on, and every argument threatened to tear holes in a social fabric already stretched thin by hunger and cold. Punishment mattered. Yes, rules mattered, of course. But above all, unity mattered more. Consider the mathematics of survival. A mammoth hunt was not a solo sport. You needed scouts to track, strategists to plan, hunters to strike, and carriers to haul the mountain of meat back home. If even one link in that chain broke, if someone sulked and refused to help, or someone held a grudge and sabotaged the effort, the whole group might go hungry. That truth hung over every interaction, shaping behavior more powerfully than any threat of punishment. People cooperated because their lives depended on it. Unity was oxygen. Without it, the fire went out. When someone broke the rules, the group had to tread carefully. Punishment was important, yes, but the point wasn't to destroy the offender, it was to knit them back into the group. Imagine the cost of exile, losing not just a mouth to feed, but a pair of arms to carry wood, a set of eyes to spot predators, a memory of where the berries grew last spring. Even if the person had erred, they were still valuable. To cast them out was to weaken the whole, and so punishments leaned toward correction, toward shame and mockery, rather than annihilation. Unity showed itself in strange little rituals. After conflict, people shared food, deliberately, making sure the guilty one still had a bite. After mockery, laughter softened into camaraderie, reminding the punished that they still belonged. Even harsh stories about spirits and punishments ended with the same lesson. Better to stay together, better to endure embarrassment than to risk the cold silence of being alone. Children absorbed this instinct from their first steps. They saw that laughter smoothed quarrels, that sharing healed rifts, that a group which teased each other relentlessly still slept, shoulder to shoulder, at night. They learned that punishment was not about cruelty, but about weaving threads tighter, preventing tears in the fabric. If someone laughed with you, even at your expense, it meant they wanted you to stay. The value of unity extended beyond immediate survival. Groups with strong cohesion passed down stories, tools, and techniques more reliably. A fractured band might lose knowledge with the departure of a single skilled member. A united one spread knowledge like fire, ensuring that skills became communal property rather than individual secrets. In this way, unity protected not just bodies, but minds. It kept memory alive. Think of the warmth of the fire at night, the hush of voices, the rhythm of a story shared. Punishment was an interlude, a disruption in harmony. But unity was the melody that returned, steady and forgiving. In the end, keeping everyone within the circle mattered more than reminding them they had stumbled. The tribe lived and died not by the harshness of its punishments, but by the strength of its togetherness. Dark humor is a stubborn weed in the garden of human psychology. It pops up where you least expect it, at funerals, in waiting rooms, even in prehistoric camps where punishment loomed heavy. In those early nights, when someone was caught stealing or shirking duties, the punishment could sting, but the jokes cut deeper, and in a strange way, they healed. Prehistoric humor about punishment was not a frivolous distraction. It was a pressure valve, a way of letting off steam, so the group didn't explode into violence. Imagine a man caught hoarding dried berries. The elders scold him. The group murmurs disapproval. And then someone cracks, "Better hide your belly too. It looks guilty." The laughter ripples, the tension breaks, and the accused reddens but smiles. The shame lingers, but so does the belonging. He has been roasted, but he has not been exiled. The punishment is memorable, but the humor makes it livable. These jokes became folklore in themselves. A hunter who once claimed to see a mammoth where there was only a boulder might forever be called Stone Mammoth. Every time he walked past, someone would moo at him or mimic tusks with their arms. He would groan, roll his eyes, but laugh too. The mockery kept his lie alive as a warning to others, but softened it enough that he remained in the group. Humor here was both knife and balm, sharp enough to cut pride, soft enough to keep wounds from festering. Sometimes the jokes were practical. If someone neglected fire duty, they might be nicknamed Smoke, Sleeper, or teased with exaggerated snores. If someone got caught sneaking food, the group might jokingly sniff the air around them whenever they spoke, pretending to smell grease on their breath. The jokes carried the memory of failure forward without needing constant scolding. They turned punishment into story, story into laughter, and laughter into order. Even children played a part. They mimicked the nicknames, repeated the jokes, and in doing so, absorbed the rules. A child who laughed at the stone mammoth knew instinctively not to lie about game. A child who giggled at Smoke Sleeper knew never to let the fire die. Humor etched lessons deeper than fear ever could. Of course, sometimes the jokes bordered on cruelty. The laughter could be relentless, turning embarrassment into torment. But even then, it was preferable to exile. Better to be the butt of a joke for a season than to vanish into the night. Better to endure groans of laughter than to face the silence of abandonment. In that sense, even dark humor was mercy, though it was mercy with a sting. And you can picture it. The group settling by the fire after a long day, the guilty one groaning as yet another joke is aimed at them. Laughter erupts, heads shake, stories of past mistakes are retold. The group bonds over shared ridicule, and the lesson is reinforced. It is harsh, it is funny, it is unforgettable. And in the rhythm of that laughter, the tribe remembers its most important rule. Survival is collective, and collective survival requires both punishment and forgiveness. So prehistoric jokes about punishment weren't just silly remarks. They were part of the operating system of the tribe. They turned pain into performance, mistakes into memories, guilt into giggles. They were a reminder that even in the darkest times, humans have always laughed, even when they were supposed to be crying, especially when they were supposed to be crying. That, perhaps, is our oldest inheritance. Archaeology, for all its careful brushing and cataloguing, often feels like detective work in a world where the witnesses are dust and the crime scenes are buried under millennia of soil. When it comes to punishment in the Stone Age, the evidence is scattered, fragmentary, and often debated, but it speaks in whispers that are difficult to ignore. Real bones carry real marks, and those marks sometimes tell stories darker than the fireside legends. Imagine a skull, dug from the earth, showing repeated blows that no accident of hunting or clumsy toolwork could explain. The breaks are deliberate, intentional, precise. The archaeologists gather around and frown, because bones like these hint at a punishment carried out long ago, a ritual reminder that rules were enforced with stone tools, as sharp as any law. Evidence from sites across Europe and Asia shows cut marks on bones that do not match butchery. They are too careful, too systematic, appearing in places that suggest stripping flesh for reasons other than dinner. Some researchers argue these were funerary practices, ways of honoring or transforming the dead, but others suggest punishment, a deliberate humiliation of the body, meant to mark a transgressor even beyond death. Imagine being told, as the fire crackles, if you steal from the group, not only will you die, but we will cut away your flesh, so your spirit walks the world naked. Whether literal or symbolic, the threat would have been chilling. Archaeology has also uncovered burials that suggest social shaming. Some bodies are placed away from the main group, interred without tools or ornaments, denied the honors given to others. That absence is its own kind of punishment. You can almost hear the whispers as the soil was packed over the body. He is not one of us anymore. For the archaeologist kneeling centuries later, the silence of grave goods is louder than any shout. It tells of exclusion, of someone marked not only in life, but in eternity. And then there are signs of trauma healed poorly, or not at all. Broken bones that show no attempt at care, no splinting, no healing. In communities where injuries were usually tended because every hand was needed, these neglected wounds suggest deliberate neglect, a punishment carried out not by blows, but by withholding kindness. Imagine breaking a leg and the group simply turning their backs, letting nature do what punishment demanded. It was slower, quieter, but no less final. Of course, archaeology has its limits. A cut mark might mean ritual. A lonely grave might mean exile. A broken bone might mean accident. Much is guesswork, patched together with educated imagination. But the patterns repeat enough that it's hard not to see intent. Repetition, whispers, design, clusters of strange burials, systematic marks on bones, absences of care, all speak of rules and of consequences for breaking them. Humor slips in even here, though. Imagine the archaeologist crouched in a muddy trench, brushing dirt off a pelvis and muttering, "Looks like this guy really annoyed someone." The students laugh nervously, half horrified, half entertained by the bluntness of human history. Our ancestors may have had fewer jokes about Netflix and taxes, but they probably shared the same uneasy chuckles when punishment turned grim. Laughter has always been our way of processing fear, even if the bones suggest the laughter came after someone had already paid the price. So what does archaeology suggest? That punishment was real, that it was sometimes brutal, that it was often symbolic, and that it mattered enough to leave marks lasting thousands of years. Bones do not lie, though they leave room for interpretation. And every mark, every lonely grave, every absence of care reminds us that justice, however crude, was as old as community itself. The transition from these early, improvised punishments into something resembling organized justice was not sudden. It was as gradual as the slow shaping of stone into blades, as incremental as the taming of fire. In the earliest days, rules were enforced by immediate consensus, by the voices around the fire, by the weight of shame and the sting of mockery. But as groups grew, as communities linked into tribes and tribes into villages, the mechanisms of justice had to evolve. 30 people can watch each other constantly, can laugh, or scold someone back into line. But 300? 3,000? That requires structure. Picture a small band where punishment is decided by elders on the spot. Someone steals meat, and the group roasts him verbally, and maybe literally. The laughter dies down, he is shamed, and the lesson is learned. It works because everyone saw the crime, and everyone saw the punishment. But scale it up, and suddenly half the group wasn't present when the crime happened. Rumors spread, arguments flare. Did he steal meat, or was it gifted? Did she lie about the hunt, or did she simply misremember? Without shared knowledge, punishment becomes contested, and contested punishment breeds division. Out of this problem emerged the first fragile threads of organized justice, rules that were codified, not in stone tablets yet, but in ritual, in repeated patterns, in decisions remembered and retold as precedent. Over generations, storytelling hardened into tradition, tradition into expectation, expectation into law. An elder might say, "We punish meat theft this way, because that is how it was done in my youth, and in my father's youth, and in his father's." Memory became authority. Justice shifted from improvisation to ritual, from consensus in the moment to structure across time. As groups expanded into villages, punishments became more visible, more theatrical. Public shaming was no longer just laughter around a fire, but ceremonies in front of the whole settlement. Exile became formal, with rituals of stripping ornaments or painting faces black before sending someone away. Humiliation became spectacle, because spectacle worked. It carried lessons across larger groups, teaching rules through shared witness. The seeds of trials, of courts, of codified law were planted in those spectacles. The logic was always the same. Unity mattered more than cruelty. Punishments aimed not to destroy, but to deter, to restore order, to keep the group whole. But with larger numbers, mercy was harder to balance with efficiency. A single exile in a band of 30 was devastating. In a community of 300, it was survivable. And so punishments grew harsher, less forgiving, more standardized. Where once a joke sufficed, now a ritual scar did. Where once exile meant probable death, now it meant a chance at survival elsewhere. The transition also reflected changes in belief. Spirits once thought to police behavior gave way to gods imagined on grander scales, gods who demanded order not just in families, but in nations. Punishment became not only a social necessity, but a sacred duty. To fail to punish was to risk divine anger, drought, famine, collapse. Fear remained, but it was wrapped in new robes, carried by priests and leaders, rather than whispered by a circle of elders. And through it all, humor survived. Even in early civilizations, graffiti mocked officials, plays ridiculed judges, and jokes about thieves circulated in taverns. The laughter softened the harshness of organized justice, just as it had softened the sting of tribal punishment. Some things, it seems, never changed. So the transition was slow, uneven, often brutal, but always guided by the same principle: survival through unity. From the laughter of 30 around a fire to the decrees of kings carved into stone, the goal was the same: to keep the group intact, to prevent chaos, to remind everyone that belonging was life and disobedience was death. Organized justice was not an invention, it was an evolution, born of necessity, shaped by fear, hardened by memory, and softened, always, by laughter. Reflection is a strange thing. It sneaks up on you in quiet moments, like when you're lying in a soft bed, staring at the ceiling, and you suddenly realize just how absurdly comfortable your life is compared to the lives of your ancestors. Imagine explaining to a Stone Age hunter that you complain about your mattress being too firm. The man has just spent another night curled against a cave wall with a damp hide stuck to his back, fleas marching up his legs like they paid rent, and smoke stinging his eyes from a fire that almost went out at dawn. He would look at you, bewildered, and probably grunt something along the lines of, "Too firm? You're alive, aren't you?" The truth is, modern life has spoiled us beyond measure, though that's not always a bad thing. We live in a world where sleep is, ideally, a place of rest, not a nightly battle. Beds hold us like clouds. We have pillows filled with feathers or memory foam, sheets woven so fine they'd make our ancestors weep with confusion, and climate control that keeps us from sweating through summer nights or freezing through winter. When you tuck yourself in, you are experiencing a level of luxury that kings in the ancient world couldn't dream of, and cave dwellers would have killed for. Think of the contrast. In a cave, your bed was a collection of animal skins laid over rough ground, always a little damp, always a little dirty, with the faint but unmistakable aroma of wet mammoth. Your neighbors in sleep weren't just your family, they were the lice, the ticks, the rodents skittering nearby, and the occasional snake that thought your hide pile looked like prime real estate. If you rolled over in the night, you weren't greeted by a cool side of the pillow, but by a face full of dirt or the elbow of your cousin who had terrible breath and a habit of snoring like an angry boar. We are lucky, so unbelievably lucky, to have privacy in our sleeping arrangements. Back then, there was no such thing as personal space. The idea of my room would have been laughable. You slept where there was room, often tangled in a communal sprawl, shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip. Warmth was shared whether you wanted it or not. Babies cried, elders coughed, dogs barked, and outside, predators padded close enough that sometimes you could smell them in the wind. A cave was a bedroom, yes, but it was also a hallway, a living room, and sometimes a latrine. Not exactly ideal conditions for drifting into dreamland. And let's not forget the constant threat that your sleep might be interrupted by something catastrophic. A fire sputtering out in the night wasn't just annoying, it was potentially fatal. Wake up to find the embers cold, and you'd better hope someone could spark new flames quickly before frostbite took hold. And if you were unlucky enough to have chosen a cave too close to a predator's den, your alarm clock might have been a cave lion deciding that your sleeping group looked like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Compare that with the mild irritation of your phone buzzing at 6 a.m. because you forgot to turn off notifications. Somehow, perspective makes the phone alarm feel less cruel. It's funny too, how much our brains carry these ancient echoes even now. We still sleep best when we feel safe, when the doors are locked, the lights are low, and the noises around us are predictable. We inherited that instinct from ancestors who knew that unpredictable noises often meant danger. That soft hum of the fan in your bedroom is like a lullaby, precisely because it drowns out the silence that once meant predators could creep too close. Our need for comfort, for blankets and security, is a reflection of the long history of nights spent shivering in caves, waiting for dawn. So when you lie back in your modern bed, reflect on how fortunate you are. You are not gnawing on bugs for a midnight snack. You are not lying awake with fleas nipping at your ankles. You are not whispering prayers to the fire gods that the smoke will last until morning. You are clean, safe, warm, and free to drift into sleep with worries far gentler than those of survival. And maybe, just maybe, you can smile at the thought that your ancestors endured so you could enjoy the ridiculous luxury of complaining about thread counts and mattress firmness. It's not weakness, it's victory. Their caves built your castles, their hides became your blankets, and their endless scratching and shivering became your bedtime comfort. Sleep wind down is the gentle slope at the end of this story, the soft descent from thought to dream, from wakefulness to rest. You've wandered through caves and punishments, through laughter and fear, through the cold realities of ancient nights. Now it is time to let all of that fade, to let it dissolve like mist in morning sun, leaving only calm, steady warmth behind. Imagine yourself no longer crouched in the dirt of a cave, but stretched out under blankets that hold you with patience. Your body is safe, your breath is slow, and the world is quiet. The fire in your imagination is still burning, but it is not desperate now. It doesn't sputter or struggle. It glows steadily, casting soft light on stone walls, on faces relaxed in sleep, on shadows that are gentle instead of menacing. You are inside that warmth, protected by the memory of community but alone in your peace. The harsh trials of the Stone Age, the mockery, the punishments, the whispers of fear, they are all part of history now. They do not belong to your night. They are stories that kept you company while your thoughts settled. Nothing more. Let your muscles unwind, one by one, shoulders heavy, arms loose, legs soft. Each part of your body drifts downward, sinking deeper into the mattress beneath you. The air is steady, cool against your face, warm against your chest. Nothing is demanded of you now. No fire to watch, no meat to guard, no spirits to appease. Just the rhythm of your breath, steady as a drum, carrying you closer to sleep. Picture the stars above, the same stars your ancestors saw. They are constant, eternal, but you do not need to watch them as they did. You do not need to guard against predators creeping in the dark. The stars are there for beauty, for calm, for wonder. They can watch over you while you rest. All you need to do is close your eyes and let the soft weight of the night carry you away. If thoughts come, let them pass, like sparks rising from the fire. They drift upward, flicker, and vanish into the dark. You don't need to follow them. You don't need to hold them. Just let them burn out and fade, leaving your mind clear, empty, and ready for dreams. Now the cave walls dissolve. The firelight fades. All that remains is warmth, softness, and the quiet certainty that you are safe. You are not exiled. You are not mocked. You are not on trial. You are simply here, breathing, resting, held by the modern miracle of a bed built for comfort. The long journey through history has brought you here, to this moment of peace. And as your eyelids grow heavier, as your breath deepens, as the edges of thought blur into dream, you can smile at the simplest truth of all. You survived the day, just as they did, and now you can rest. And now, as the fire in our story fades to embers, it's time for you to drift into your own safe, warm sleep. Let your breath slow, let your thoughts soften, and rest deeply. You've earned it. If your eyes are still open and your mind's still wandering, don't worry. You can click one of the two videos on the screen and keep exploring with me until you're ready to drift off. And if you enjoyed this journey through the shadows of prehistory, remember to subscribe so you'll always have another story waiting when sleep feels far away. Sleep well.